who is going to clean up this mess? We are at episode number 9 of our Get Into RC Videos series. How's it going, everybody? I'm Greg with RC Driver, and this episode is about drivetrain part names. Now, in episode number 8, I talked about suspension, and here we are in episode number 9, and I'm going to tell you all the different components inside of an RC car's drivetrain. Now, I actually thought that this was going to be kind of easy, but it turns out I don't think it's going to be. There's got to be a lot of stuff I have to cover. I've actually been tearing apart cars all morning just so I could show you all the different types of components that there are. I'm going to cover two-wheel drive drivetrains. I'm going to cover four-wheel drive drivetrains. I'm going to talk about differentials and the different types. I'm going to talk about different types of drive shafts. There's a lot of stuff to cover, so head over to the workbench with me and I'm going to show you all the different parts, so by the time we're done with this episode, you're a pro on RC car drivetrains. Once again, I do have a two-wheel drive vehicle and a four-wheel drive vehicle to talk about the different types of drivetrain parts because they are different between the two. So for the two-wheel drive, I have a Traxxas Bigfoot here, and for the four-wheel drive, I have a Traxxas Rally Car. So let's get started here on the two-wheel drive, and I'm going to talk about from the outside, working my way in, just like I did last time with the suspension. So over here, we have a wheel nut, and I kind of mentioned that last time. And moving inboard, we have the stub shaft of the axle, and I'll go into the axle a little bit more in just a bit. But moving along here, I have a 12 millimeter hex on this. Most 10 scale cars come with a 12 millimeter hex. And I kind of mentioned last time in the suspension video that there are different size wheel hexes. So this one here is a 17 millimeter wheel hex. And these come in a variety of sizes, and it kind of depends on the size of the car. Perhaps like an 18 scale car, it may be a 8 millimeter wheel hex. On a 10 scale car, typically it's a 12 millimeter wheel hex. On an 8 scale car, it's a 17 millimeter wheel hex. And then for very large scale cars, sometimes there's 23 millimeter, 24 millimeter. So you really just need to know what size your vehicle has before you go out and perhaps purchase some rims. And then moving even farther in here, we have where the bearings are that sit in the hub. And I actually have some bearings down here. Let me just shift this over. All right, so these are the different types of bearings and actually bushings that you could find in an RC car. So this is a plastic bushing, and these come with a lot of low budget vehicles. This particular one is from a Tamiya car, and they get the job done, but they do wear. You do need to make sure they're clean and oiled all the time. This is a bronze bushing or an oilite bushing. And the reason why they call it an oilite bushing is because it needs a light coating of oil on it for it to spin freely. This will last a bit longer than a plastic bushing, but it does wear as well. Now, what we really recommend, a lot of companies recommend, a lot of drivers want to see are ball bearings in their kits, and these last a long time. So over here, this is a metal shielded bearing, this is a fiber shielded bearing, and this is a rubber shielded bearing. Now, a lot of it depends on what you're going to use it for, on when you're going to pick the different style of bearing. So if you're in a racing class, you probably want like a metal shielded bearing, a metal shielded bearing, or a fiber shielded bearing because there's less friction on it. A rubber shielded bearing helps keep a lot more dirt and debris out of the bearing. So this is better for like rock crawlers and trail trucks. And then there's a hybrid bearing where perhaps there is a rubber shield on one side and a metal shield on the other side. And the rubber shield side always faces the outside where it's going to get dirty. And the metal shield goes on the inside. And sometimes there isn't even a shield at all. There'll just be a shield on one side for higher end race vehicles. And that is again to just reduce friction. So a lot of detail there just in some bearings and bushings. Now with the bearings out of the way, we could talk about the axle differences or drive shafts. So let's start over here on the two-wheel drive. On this specific truck, this is a Traxxas telescoping universal. So the reason why they call it a telescoping is two pieces here, and the one side telescopes in and out on the other side when the suspension is compressed. All right, and then down here is the universal joint. It is a cross pin with a small metal joint, so you can kind of see it in there. And out here it goes out to the stub shaft. This portion of it here is called the yoke. And even on this side, that is the yoke side of the drive shaft. And up top here, let me spin this around. Over here, this is the outdrive yoke. Okay, So now on a four-wheel drive, on this particular four-wheel drive, it's a little bit different. So this is what they call a spline universal drive shaft. It's a CV joint, and I have an example of that, but basically, you can see there's a lot of different styles. So this here is a CV style drive shaft. Now let me just go over the parts again. Here we have the wheel nut. This is the stub shaft. This is the cross pin, and that's where the wheel hex gets its drive from. And then here is the CV joint, all right? And that's a little bit different from that the universal joint that I showed you. And inside of there are these components right here. So we have a barrel, the cross pin, and sometimes a set screw to retain that cross pin. And then after that, we have the drive shaft itself, and then it usually goes to an outdrive cup. This isn't for this particular drive shaft, but this is an outdrive, and usually it's called an outdrive because it comes out of the differential, but there's also an outdrive cup, and this is just a little bit of a different style here. So as you can see, it doesn't have that stub shaft on there, so that's when it's called an outdrive cup, and it screws onto a shaft that comes out of the differential. And I'll talk about the differential very shortly here. And this particular drive shaft right here is called a dog bone because it looks like a dog bone. Now we move farther into the differential case, and differential cases are typically found on four-wheel drive cars because it just houses the differential and the pinion gear that goes out to the drivetrain. So it's just the case by itself. Now when it's called a transmission is over here. We have a transmission case, and there's the case here. You can see the whole case. And there's a number of gears in here. So we have the differential, it's located down inside. We have an idler gear, and then we have a top shaft gear. And that's usually when it's called a transmission. Also on the outside of a transmission, typically you'll find a gear cover. Under here is the pinion and spur gear, which I will show in a little bit. Got a lot of things that need to be uncovered here, but that gives you the idea of a gear cover. And sometimes there is a motor plate behind here. I'll show that as well, but over here on the four-wheel drive car, we have a motor plate that you can see on this particular car. So here's the motor plate right here, and they come in various forms. So this is an aluminum motor plate, and the one you saw over on the Traxxas the Traxxas Bigfoot over here, this is an integrated motor plate, so it's actually part of the transmission case. There's a lot of variety of things going on and different styles of car. It just depends on the manufacturer, but you get the general idea. I've gone ahead and pulled the transmission out of the Bigfoot here so we could just take a closer look at everything going on. And again, this is the transmission case here, and this is kind of that motor plate I told you about. This one is integrated, but sometimes this is aluminum on different car kits. So let me start over on this side. So we've got our motor screws that hold the motor to the motor plate here. This small gear here, this is your pinion gear, and this is your spur gear. All right, and these come in different sizes, so you could alter your speed and power. And then over here we have the slipper assembly that is behind this gear, and it's held in with three screws, as you could see. And this is a slipper adjusting nut. Some cars do not have a slipper. They are just it's a solid top shaft here. So if you don't see the spring assembly and the clutch parts that I'm about to show you, it is just a solid top shaft where this is, again, a slipper clutch. All right, so let me take this out so I can just show you some more of the individual parts behind a slipper clutch. All right, so again, that's the tension nut. We've got the tension spring, and sometimes there is a ball bearing to support the gear. And then back here we have parts of the slipper assembly. So I'll talk about here first. So this is a slipper hub or a slipper plate, they call it sometimes. And then these are the slipper pads. And sometimes it's just a single pad. Sometimes there's two similar pads, but Traxxas, they use these small 3-shoe pads here. So that's just, again, there's a bunch of different styles out there, and depending on your vehicle, it may change. So this is also a slipper plate. So that's the plate that those shoes ride on, and those shoes press against that plate. It has a slipping motion to help distribute the power, prevent shock to the drivetrain. So it's got multiple uses there. So that's the plate. And then again, we have another slipper hub here, and then below it is usually another cross pin. All right. Now this is part of the top shaft. This is the top shaft that comes out of the transmission here. And you'll see the other side of it in here where it transfers the power. Okay, so we got a couple parts all over the place here. So here's that top shaft. And there's the top shaft gear there, and as you can see, there is another cross pin typically. And this is the differential. So in this particular truck, this is a planetary gear differential, and I'm going to show you the details of that in just a bit. So let's look in here. So this is the idler gear right here, and this is the idler gear shaft. And then as you can see, there are a number of rubber shielded ball bearings inside this transmission, and a number of shims here to help prevent the gears from moving around. On a four-wheel drive car, the inside of the gear case looks a bit different from the two-wheel drive car. So as you can see, we just have a differential right here. This is the ring gear of the differential. This is the differential cup, and I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. But let me pull this out because I want to show you inside. So inside here, you can see it is a pinion gear. This is what they call a pinion gear. So it's a ring and pinion. The ring is on the differential, and the pinion is in there, and it's got a stub shaft that goes out to the drivetrain. Now we're on to differentials, and as you can see, there are a number of different styles. So I've broken out a number of them, and I have a huge mess on my workbench here, but I got to show you all the different styles and talk about some of the parts that are on the inside here. So let's start at this end with this Traxxas differential. This is out of that Bigfoot. This is a planetary differential. So as you can see, there are a number of gears in here, and they are offset and they rotate for the differential action. Here's one of the straight cut gears here, and here's one of the guide pins for that gear. And then we have the outer gear, the differential gear here, and it's integrated into the cup. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the cup is separate, but on this particular kit it is. And then we have the differential end cap for this particular one. And this is the outdrive shaft that I told you about, and either a cup gets screwed onto the end of this, the outdrive cup, or in this particular case, an outdrive yoke gets screwed onto that shaft. All right, so that's a planetary differential. And this particular differential is a grease-filled differential. It doesn't have any seals on it. So when you have a differential that doesn't have any seals, you always use grease. When it is a sealed differential, I'll show you over there, you use an oil. So over here, this is an example of a sealed differential here. This is out of an A-scale buggy. So I'm going to start at this end over here. Let me move this over here. All right, so this is the outdrive that I told you about again. And this goes out to the drive shaft. And this particular one here, this has the shaft that goes inside to mate up with the gears. And so it goes, typically a bearing goes on here. Your outdrive goes in through there. And as you can see, it pops up and it connects to the spider gear with this cross pin. So this cross pin will go through that shaft and it'll hold that gear in there down in the bottom. All right. And sometimes there's a washer and an O-ring. So this is your seal right here. This is your O-ring seal. And that'll go down in the recess in there. And sometimes the washer will go over that. It just depends on the design from the manufacturers. But that is the outdrive cup right there. And then moving into the center, here is the differential spider gears. So sometimes there's 2, sometimes there's 4, but basically there's the spider gears, there are 4 in this particular one. These are the cross shafts, and sometimes they're separate, sometimes they're molded together, but these are steel cross shafts, and sometimes they have spacers on the end to just take up some of the slop inside of the differential, so you could adjust it later. And then this is that ring gear that I showed you before. And here's that O-ring seated in there. It gives you an idea of how that is set up. But this is a sealed differential, and sometimes there'll be a gasket here for the sealed differential, or most of the time there'll be a gasket here for the sealed differential. And that's what seals everything up. So you could use a differential oil inside of it. And there's a differential oil tube right there. So that's the 7,000 weight, and there's different weights to change the action of the differential. And then back over with the regular differential, you use a standard grease. This is a Cow RC grease, or whatever grease came with your particular kit. All right. Now, ball differential, and there's a lot of parts in a ball differential. So let's start at the end here. So this is the outdrive, and as you can see, it's a little bit different from the other outdrives. This particular outdrive gets a plate on it, or a differential ring. So that would go on top of there. And inside of here, it gets a differential nut and a differential tension spring. And this helps tension the pressure on the differential. Then moving in towards the center of the diff. So this is the diff gear. And as you can see, inside of it are differential balls. So there's a variety of balls in there. And in the center here is a ball bearing, and that's used for support. There's another ball bearing. Most ball differentials have 2 internal bearings in them for support. Then we have another outdrive that would go on the top. So let me just kind of show you how this all goes together. So the gear goes there, and then this spring would go inside here. The differential nut goes inside here. All right, so you kind of get a feel for how that goes. Then we have another support wash or support bearing. And then we have a diff ring and the other outdrive. So that's how it looks when it's together. And then over here is the thrust assembly. All right, so here is your diff tension screw. We have the thrust washers here. There's 2 thrust washers, and then these are the thrust balls right here. So these all make up an assembly. I'll kind of show you how it goes. So the washer goes on the end of the screw here. And then these balls, you put a dab of grease, and then these balls all sit in here. And then they are compressed by the other washer. So all the balls would sit in there down towards the end. And you put grease in there. And then this slides into the end of the ball differential assembly. And then it actually gets capped off on this particular model with a thrust cap. But so what you do is once you have everything assembled, you tighten it down, and you want to make sure your differential action is smooth. Now, if you have a ball differential in your car and it doesn't, seems to be grinding, feels really gritty, the main thing that usually goes in a ball differential is the thrust balls go first. As you can see, they're pretty small and they're really affected by dirt. But if you go and rebuild a differential, you should really just rebuild the majority of the balls and washers and thrust assembly. It's just the best route to do in order to get a perfectly working ball differential. And that's how a gear differential will sort of look once it's together. And then this is what the planetary diff looks when it's put together. Let's just jump right into the trail truck axle or the crawler axle. And this particular axle right here is from Axial Racing. It's one of their AR60 axles. It's off of my Wraith Spawn. So this is the axle housing right here. And then this is the axle or the differential cover, pumpkin cover, sometimes people call it. So that's the cover right there. And once you pop that off, you could see the ring gear inside here, and there are some differences on the inside. So we don't have drive shafts, we have straight axle shafts here. You can kind of see it's just a straight shaft. Goes all the way from the drive gear assembly all the way out straight to the wheel. And of course there would be a 12mm hex, and there's the pin under there. But you get the idea of how a straight axle works there. And then on the other side is the pinion output, and you can see it's supported by a bearing there, and I'll show you the other side of the pinion gear in a second. So what I want to do is actually show you what the gear assembly is like on the inside of a trail truck. All right, so we've got the ball bearings for support here, and I've actually gone ahead and removed the screws from the ring gear. So you can see inside there are no gears inside. This is a lockout, or sometimes people call it a spool. Sometimes it doesn't have this diff case. It's a spool that goes right to the ring gear. So there's different variations, but you get the idea that most trail trucks, most crawlers don't have internal gears here. They use a lockout. And finally over here inside, there's another look at that internal pinion gear right there. You can just kind of see it, and that's what drives the rear assembly. Next up, I want to talk about a few different drive line types. And what I have right here is a direct drive car. So this is an on-road car here. I actually had to dig this out. Most of my on-road cars are done at a local hobby shop. But this is a direct drive. So the motor drives the spur gear here. The motor and pinion drive the spur gear here directly to the wheels. Now there's actually a ball differential in here. There's those balls that I showed you inside the spur. And then out here is a thrust bearing typically. But the axle shaft here is a graphite, sometimes it's a fiberglass, and then they have the wheel hubs out here. So this is a direct drive style car. Now we have a belt driven style car. So as you can see here, this has drive belts to drive the front and rear of the car, and the belts roll over pulleys. So you can see right in here we have some pulleys, and the differentials have pulleys as well. So this is a belt drive style. And finally, we have a shaft drive style. So as you can see here, there are shafts running from the motor assembly, motor and differential assembly. This is a center diff here to the front differential and rear differential.
You may have picked up I said center differential. So some cars, they do some four-wheel drive cars, they have a center differential and the spur is attached, pinion is attached, much similar to what I talked about previously, but the drive here is a shaft drive. And the shaft drive can come in different forms. So this here is a tube style shaft drive, and this actually has a slipper clutch on it, or they have a center diff option. So again, there's a lot of different varieties out there depending on the type of vehicle that you do buy. Finally, to wrap up this episode, what I'm going to talk about are nitro clutches. All right, so I have some clutch parts here. I dug through my bins just to find a little bit of everything here. So I'm actually going to start off in the center here with the flywheel. So these are different flywheel types, 4-shoe, 3-shoe, and 2-shoe, and you can tell by the pins that are here. And these are the clutch shoes. All right, so we have some plastic clutch shoes over here. We have aluminum clutch shoes. And these over here are the clutch springs. So depending on the style of flywheel that you have, it will depend on the number of clutch shoes you install on the car. And so some drivers, they like a variation. They like to run all aluminum. Sometimes they'll run aluminum and plastic. Some ready to runs, they come specifically with just plastic because it's less in cost. So it really just depends on the type of performance you're looking to get for your particular car and what you're going to install. And then the springs, they come with various diameter wire, so it changes the action of the clutch. Now up here, this is a collet. This goes on the crankshaft of the engine, and that's what helps secure the flywheel to the crankshaft. And then the clutch nut, which is what this is, presses down on that. It's threaded, so it screws down and pinches that assembly on there, and that makes up your clutch. Now, just to throw it out here, this is a pilot shaft. They don't typically use these anymore, but just in case you have a vintage model, you're checking this out, this is a pilot shaft, and that takes place of the clutch nut, and that's what the bearing and clutch bell assembly ride on. So this is the clutch bell right here. And as you can see, I have a bearing in there. That they have a bearing on each side actually, and that is basically the pinion gear of a nitro motor, where you have just a single gear on an electric motor. On a nitro car, you have a clutch bell, and that's what that is.
I have a lot of work to do. I took all those cars apart to show you everything I could about drivetrains, and I hope I answered all of your questions, and I hope that you know what all the drivetrain parts are now. So next time you walk into a hobby shop and need something, you know exactly what to call it. Now, next week, I'm going to talk about chassis parts. So make sure you click that subscribe button and that notification button so you get notified when that video pops up. We got a lot more Get Into RC videos coming, so I hope to see you back for all the rest of them.